Before there was an empire, before the thunder of cannons and the red of maps, there was only an island, a green and misted land, drifting in the grey waters of the North Atlantic. Its shores were rugged, its forests thick with oak and ash, its hills crowned with stone circles and ruins that whispered of ages even older than memory. Long before England had a name, this island had many. To the Romans, it was Britannia, cold, wild, untamed. To the Saxons, it was Englerland, the land of their kin. To the Vikings, it was a prize to be raided, plundered, conquered, and lost again. And through those centuries of invasion and resilience, something unique began to form. Not yet an empire, not yet even a nation, but a spirit. It was a spirit of survival. The Romans had come with their legions, their walls, and their roads, only to vanish into legend. After them came waves of tribes, Angles, Saxons, Jutes building wooden kingdoms on rivers and hills. They brought with them songs and sagas, the beginnings of a tongue that would one day be called English. And then, in the year 1066, the island's destiny changed forever. A comet blazed across the night sky, fiery, impossible, a streak of fate. Not long after, on the fields of Hastings, two worlds collided. The Anglo-Saxon king Harold Godwinson, weary from battle, faced William of Normandy, a duke from across the sea. The battle was fierce, brutal, and swift. When it was done, Harold lay dead, and William, now the conqueror, took his crown. The Norman conquest bound England to Europe, reshaping its tongue, its law, its very soul. Stone castles rose from the earth, cathedrals pierced the clouds. French and English merged like rivers, creating a new language, the voice of kings and peasants alike. The feudal order took root, and a new kingdom began to dream of greatness. Yet greatness was not born overnight. For centuries, England was not an empire, but a puzzle, a patchwork of lords, barons, and monarchs clawing for control. The Plantagenets, fierce, ambitious rulers from France, forged dynasties that spanned continents. Kings like Henry II, who laid down the laws that would echo through ages, and Eleanor of Aquitaine, who brought refinement and rebellion in equal measure. But power has its price. The crown and its vassals clashed, and in 1215, on the fields of Runnymede, a weary king named John was forced to sign a parchment that would change the world, the Magna Carta. It was only ink and vellum, but within it lay an idea that even kings could be bound by law. That moment, quiet and unassuming, planted a seed that would one day grow into parliament, democracy, and the rule of reason over power. The empire that would come centuries later would carry both its promise and its contradictions. As the Middle Ages deepened, England turned its gaze outward, across the Channel, toward France. The 100 Years' War began not as conquest, but as inheritance, a dispute over crowns and bloodlines. Yet it became something more. It was there that England's sense of destiny began to take shape, its armies clad in iron, its archers wielding the longbow, its kings crowned with thunder. At Crécy and Agincourt, English arrows darkened the sky. The mud of France ran red beneath the hooves of knights. Henry V, young and fearless, became the stuff of legend, immortalized in the words of Shakespeare centuries later. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. But wars, even glorious ones, end in loss. By the time the last battle was fought, England had lost nearly all it had gained. Its dream of France had burned away, leaving behind a different kind of ambition, not for the land across the Channel, but for the seas beyond. At home, storms brewed in the bloodline. Civil war, the Wars of the Roses, tore the realm apart. York against Lancaster, red rose against white, brother against brother. For 30 years, the throne of England was a prize fought over in shadows and battlefields. And when at last peace came, it came with a new dynasty, the Tudors. From this union of chaos and order rose a king named Henry VII, cautious and calculating, who stitched the kingdom back together. His son, Henry VIII, would undo it again. But in doing so, he would set England on a path the world had never seen before. Under Henry, the church itself was broken apart. When Rome refused to grant him what he wanted, a divorce, a son, a legacy, he took from it what he needed, power. The Church of England was born, and faith became politics. Monasteries were seized, abbeys fell to ruin, gold poured into the royal treasury, and for the first time, England began to feel like something new, not just a kingdom, but a power in its own right, no longer kneeling to any pope or emperor. Yet it was under Elizabeth I, Henry's daughter, that the transformation truly began. Her reign was a golden dawn. The Renaissance filled England's halls with art, music, and words. Shakespeare's plays stirred hearts. Explorers like Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh sailed into the unknown. The seas became England's new frontier, the horizon, its destiny. When the Spanish Armada came in 1588, a fleet of mighty ships bearing the might of Catholic Europe, Elizabeth stood before her troops and declared, "I have the heart and stomach of a king." And when the storm cleared, it was England that remained. The Armada was scattered. The seas, once ruled by Spain, now belonged to a new contender. This victory was not just survival. It was the beginning of something vast. The sailors who circled the globe returned not only with stories but with maps. New lands appeared in English minds: the Americas, India, Africa, places of promise and peril, of riches and ruin. At first, England's ventures abroad were small, a trading post here, a colony there. But behind every voyage was the same restless energy that had driven the island through centuries of invasion and resistance. It was the same fire that had built castles, defied popes, and written laws that even kings must obey. The island had become something greater than itself, an idea in motion. An empire was not yet born, but its breath could already be felt in the salt of the sea air, in the sails that caught the wind off Plymouth's coast, in the eyes of those who looked west and whispered of the world waiting beyond the horizon. And so, as the 16th century faded into the 17th, England, small, proud and scarred, stood at the edge of a new age. It was no longer the kingdom that had once been conquered. Now, it would be the one that conquered others. The tides were turning, and in their pull an empire began to stir, not in glory but in curiosity, not in peace, but in power. The age of ambition had begun. The sound of church bells echoed across the green hills of England, their chime mingling with the soft rush of the Thames and the cries of merchants in the markets below. From castle towers to muddy villages, from London's crowded docks to the sheep fields of Yorkshire, this small island had begun to hum with purpose. Yet, beneath that calm surface, the world trembled with rivalry. The crown of England, heavy with gold, older than memory, had never sat easily upon any head. The kings who wore it ruled not only over a land, but over the storm that came with it. And now, as the 15th century turned toward the 16th, the island stood on the edge of both greatness and peril. The first winds of ambition came from the continent. Across the English Channel, Europe was ablaze, not yet in fire, but in idea. The Renaissance, that bright rebirth of art, philosophy and discovery, was spilling from Italy into France and the Low Countries, whispering that the world was larger, richer, and far more complex than any medieval dream had imagined. But England, isolated by the sea, had its own dramas to play out first. The Wars of the Roses had ended with the rise of the Tudors, but old scars ran deep. Nobles who had once shed blood for rival banners now bowed with clenched fists. The new king, Henry VII, ruled with caution, suspicion, and quiet brilliance. He taxed carefully, married wisely, and built a treasury filled with gold instead of bodies. And when his son Henry VIII took the throne in 1509, that gold gleamed brighter than ever. Henry was everything his father was not: tall, handsome, reckless, burning with energy and vanity. He dreamed not only of ruling a kingdom, but of shaping destiny itself. Yet destiny, as it often does, began with love, and the lack of it. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess, had been one of diplomacy, not desire. And when years passed without a male heir, Henry's frustration grew into fury. His heart, or perhaps his pride, turned toward Anne Boleyn, a dark-haired lady of the court whose wit was as sharp as her beauty. When the Pope refused to annul his marriage, Henry broke from Rome entirely. In a single stroke he severed England from the authority of the Catholic Church, declaring himself the head of a new faith, the Church of England. Monasteries were dissolved, their wealth poured into the royal treasury. Statues of saints were torn down, Latin prayers replaced by English ones. The kingdom shuddered as centuries of faith were rewritten overnight. It was a bold act, and a dangerous one. For it was not just faith that had changed, but power. From this moment on, England would chart its own spiritual and political course, bound neither to Rome nor to any foreign crown. The seeds of empire, independence, expansion, and divine self-belief had been planted in the soil of defiance. But Henry's new world was built on fragile ground. His wives came and went like the tides, each marriage leaving behind ghosts and echoes. Anne Boleyn met the blade of an executioner's sword. Jane Seymour gave him the son he longed for, only to die in childbirth. By the time Henry himself died in 1547, the kingdom he left was divided, half Protestant, half Catholic, and wholly uncertain of its future. His children would inherit both his power and his chaos. Edward VI, young and frail, ruled briefly, but pushed England deeper into Protestant reform. When he died, his sister Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, sought to undo it all. She restored Catholicism with fire and fear, earning the name Bloody Mary. And then came Elizabeth. Her reign began like the sunrise after a storm. The court, once filled with whispers of treason and the smoke of burning heretics, now shimmered with light and colour. Elizabeth's England was alive with music, theatre, and exploration. The world itself seemed to unfold before her feet. Sailors like Francis Drake circled the globe. Poets like Shakespeare gave words to the soul of a nation. And in every harbour, ships were built for trade, for war, for dreams that stretched beyond the horizon. Yet even the Golden Age was shadowed by threat. Spain, vast, devout, and wealthy from the riches of the New World, viewed Protestant England as a heresy that had to be erased. King Philip II sent an armada, a fleet of mighty galleons, to crush Elizabeth and restore Catholic rule. But the winds of fate favoured England. In the summer of 1588, storms ripped through the Spanish fleet. English fireships and cannon tore through their formation. When the seas finally stilled, Spain's invincible armada lay scattered and broken. England had not merely survived, it had announced itself. No longer a small, isolated kingdom, it had faced the most powerful empire on earth and endured. The victory did not just protect the island, it defined it. It gave birth to a belief that the English, and soon the British, were chosen by destiny to rule the waves. But the next century would test that destiny in ways no one could yet imagine. Elizabeth died without an heir, ending the Tudor line. The crown passed to James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, uniting the two crowns under one monarch, though not yet one nation. The union of the crowns in 1603 marked a turning point. Britain was beginning to form, a concept more powerful than any single king. Yet unity brought friction. James's belief in absolute monarchy clashed with Parliament's growing demand for representation. The question that had haunted English kings since the Magna Carta, who truly holds power, the ruler or the ruled, began to roar again. When James's son, Charles I, took the throne, the tension snapped. Charles believed his right to rule came directly from God. Parliament believed that power must be shared. The struggle spiraled into one of the darkest chapters in English history, the English Civil War. Families divided, towns burned, brother fought brother. On one side stood the royalists, loyal to their king. On the other, the parliamentarians, led by a stern and brilliant general named Oliver Cromwell. In 1649, for the first time in history, the unthinkable happened. A king of England was tried and executed by his own people. The monarchy was abolished. Cromwell ruled as Lord Protector, a republic born in blood and conviction. For a moment, it seemed the old order had been shattered forever. But the tide of power, like the tide of the sea, always returns. After Cromwell's death, the monarchy was restored under Charles II, a charming, reckless figure who brought laughter and scandal back to the court. The theatres reopened. London came alive again. And then came 1688, the year of the Glorious Revolution, when Parliament, weary of tyranny, invited William of Orange and Mary, James II's daughter, to take the throne. The message was clear: kings would reign, but they would no longer rule without consent. From that fragile balance between monarch and parliament, authority and liberty, the foundation of the modern British state was laid. England, scarred but stronger, had survived conquest, schism and civil war. And in doing so, it had learned a lesson that would shape the centuries to come, that power, to endure, must bend. The storms of faith and throne had forged something new, not just a kingdom but a nation ready to look outward once more. And beyond the grey waters that ringed its shores, the world was waiting, vast, rich and open. As the 18th century approached, sails filled with wind, maps stretched across oak tables, and the British dream of trade, dominion and empire began to stir like a rising sun over the restless sea. The sea was a mirror that morning, still grey, endless. From the white cliffs of Dover, a man could look out and see nothing but mist, and yet somewhere beyond that pale horizon lay the future of a kingdom. England had always been an island, but now, in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, it began to think of itself not as a place apart, but as a place that could reach everywhere. The storms of religion and monarchy had passed, leaving behind something unexpected: stability. With a constitutional monarchy in place, Parliament strong, and London pulsing with trade, the kingdom turned outward, toward wealth, discovery, and the boundless promise of the sea. It was here, in the creak of ships and the hiss of wind through sails, that the British Empire was born. The new century belonged to merchants, as much as to kings. At the heart of this awakening stood the East India Company, a strange creature of its time, both commercial and imperial, driven by trade but powered by ambition. Chartered in 1600 by Queen Elizabeth, it had begun humbly, a handful of ships sailing to the distant shores of India to trade in silks and spices. But by the 1700s, it had become something far greater, a state within a state, flying the Union Jack over ports thousands of miles away. And as Britain's merchants set sail, so too did its missionaries, explorers and adventurers. Each voyage, each map, each letter home was a spark, and together they kindled a fire that would spread across the world. London became the heart of a new kind of empire, an empire of trade. The docks were forests of masts, the air thick with salt and ambition. Ships left the Thames bound for the Caribbean, Africa, India and beyond. They carried guns, goods and dreams, and often returned with sugar, rum, tobacco and gold. But there was a shadow upon that trade, one that would darken the empire's legacy forever. For among the cargoes of those ships were people. The Atlantic slave trade, born of greed and rationalized by false science and cruel theology, became one of the pillars of Britain's prosperity. Enslaved Africans were captured, shipped across the ocean in unimaginable suffering, and sold in the plantations of the Caribbean and the American colonies. Their labor built fortunes, fueled sugar and cotton empires, and poured wealth into the counting houses of Bristol and Liverpool. This contradiction, a nation that spoke of liberty yet profited from bondage, would haunt Britain for centuries. And yet, within this tangled web of cruelty and commerce, the empire grew. In North America, British settlers built colonies along the Atlantic coast, from Massachusetts to Virginia, from Georgia to New York. They were farmers and merchants, pilgrims and dreamers, each carving a new life in the wilderness. For a time, these distant lands seemed only an extension of home, loyal, familiar and governed by the same king. Across the seas in India, the East India Company traded and negotiated with local rulers, planting the seeds of empire in Bengal and Madras. In Africa, forts rose along the coasts, while in the Caribbean, islands like Jamaica and Barbados became jewels of sugar and pain. The British flag was still new, only since 1707, when England and Scotland had formally united, but already it flew over more corners of the globe than any before it. And as the empire expanded, so too did Britain's sense of destiny. The Age of Enlightenment was dawning, an era of reason, science, and the belief that humanity could be improved through knowledge. Philosophers like John Locke and David Hume spoke of liberty, rights, and the pursuit of truth. In the salons of London and Edinburgh, thinkers debated not only politics but the nature of man himself. But empire was not built on reason alone. It was built on ships, soldiers, and the cold arithmetic of profit. As the 18th century deepened, Britain's reach collided with other European powers. France, Spain, the Netherlands, all hungry for control of the New World. The seas became battlegrounds. Colonies changed hands like playing cards. The War of the Spanish Succession and later the 7 Years' War transformed not just Europe but the world map. British armies fought in India, in the Caribbean, in North America. Wars fought over trade routes and territory, but justified in the name of civilization and honor. When the smoke cleared after the 7 Years' War in 1763, Britain stood triumphant. France had lost most of its North American colonies. India was within Britain's grasp. The empire, now truly global, stretched from the sugar fields of the Caribbean to the tea gardens of Bengal. It was said that the sun never set on the British flag, and for the first time, it was true. But victory carries its own weight. The very colonies that had made Britain rich began to strain against the ties that bound them. In America, settlers who had fought alongside British troops during the wars now bristled at taxes and decrees from a distant parliament. No taxation without representation, they cried, and though the words sounded like law, they were prophecy. The American Revolution would soon test the empire's strength in ways no foreign enemy ever could. But before that storm broke, there was a moment, brief but brilliant, when Britain seemed unshakable. Its navy ruled the seas, its merchants ruled the markets, its thinkers ruled the age. In London, Isaac Newton's laws described the universe. In Oxford, scholars mapped the stars and the human mind alike. In Edinburgh, inventors dreamed of engines that would one day transform the world. The Industrial Revolution, still in its infancy, was beginning to hum. Factories, machines and iron rails that would soon bind continents. And at the heart of it all, the empire, not yet in its full splendor but rising like the tide, relentless and vast. Yet in the candle-lit chambers of Whitehall and Westminster, a few could already see what others could not, that this empire, so glorious in ambition, was built upon fragile foundations. The ocean could carry wealth as easily as it could swallow it. Colonies that thrived could rebel. Trade that brought gold could also bring guilt. Still, no one could resist the pull of destiny. The island that had once been content to survive was now determined to command the world. And so the ships kept sailing. East toward India, west toward America, south toward Africa. Their sails filled not only with wind, but with the breath of history itself. Each voyage, each trade, each conquest carried a promise and a question. How far could Britain go? And whispered beneath it, how long could it last? The answer would come not in centuries, but in decades. For as Britain reached outward, one of its greatest possessions, its American colonies, was already preparing to break away, changing the empire forever. But for now, in that golden hour before the storm, Britain stood supreme, a merchant's empire, a sailor's dream, and a nation awakening to its destiny beneath the rising sun of power. The dawn of empire had come. In the summer air above the Atlantic, sails billowed like wings. The same ships that once carried explorers and merchants now ferried something more volatile, ideas. Ideas of liberty, of self-rule, of equality before law. They drifted from pamphlets to taverns, from sermons to battlefields, whispered first in rebellion and then shouted in revolution. By the mid-18th century, the British Empire stood at its most confident. Its colonies in North America stretched from the frozen forests of Canada to the warm harbors of Georgia. Its merchants were rich, its navy unmatched, and its flag fluttered proudly in ports across the world. Britain was the envy of Europe, a nation whose island hearts seemed to pulse with the rhythm of global trade. But empires, like storms, are often calmest before the lightning. The seeds of unrest had been sown quietly. During the 7 Years' War, Britain had defended its American colonies from the French, but at a staggering cost. When the cannons fell silent, the treasury was near empty. Parliament sought to refill it by taxing the colonies that had benefited most from the war. It began with the Stamp Act of 1765, a seemingly small tax on printed materials. To the British it was reasonable. To the colonists it was tyranny in ink. No taxation without representation they cried, a phrase that would echo like thunder across the Atlantic. At first, London dismissed the protests as noise from distant subjects, but the noise grew louder. In Boston, men disguised as Mohawk warriors boarded ships and hurled tea into the harbor, a symbolic act of defiance known forever as the Boston Tea Party. The King, George III, earnest but unbending, saw rebellion where the colonists saw rights. What followed was a clash not just of armies, but of ideals. In 1775, muskets flared at Lexington and Concord, and the war for America's soul began. British soldiers in scarlet coats marched with precision. Colonial militias fought from woods and walls. The world watched as farmers and blacksmiths defied one of the greatest powers on earth. At first, the British believed victory was inevitable. They took cities, won battles, and drove the rebels into retreat. Yet the Americans possessed what empires often forget: a cause. They fought not for conquest, but for home, and that difference turned ragged men into legends. In 1776, a document was signed in Philadelphia, the Declaration of Independence. Its words, penned by Thomas Jefferson, soared beyond rebellion and into eternity. All men are created equal. To Britain it was treason, to the world it was revelation. Years of bitter war followed, of sieges, betrayals, winters without food or shoes. The British Army, stretched thin across oceans, found itself fighting ghosts. In 1781, at Yorktown, General Cornwallis surrendered. The American dream was born, and the British Empire, for the first time, had stumbled. When peace was signed 2 years later, Britain's empire was smaller, but its vision was larger. The loss of America forced the nation to look east instead of west, toward India, Africa, and beyond. The empire that emerged from defeat would be colder, harder, and far more global, and back home the winds of change had only just begun to stir. The Industrial Revolution was awakening. The same smoke that rose from factories would soon power ships and forge weapons. Steam, iron, and invention became the new engines of empire. In London, factories clanged beside the Thames. In Manchester and Birmingham, looms and furnaces glowed through the night. Workers poured into cities, chasing wages and survival. The streets filled with soot and hunger, the price of progress. Yet amid that smoke and hardship, Britain discovered its new identity. Not just a nation of sailors and soldiers, but of inventors, engineers, and industrialists. While America built its republic, Britain built the machinery of empire. Meanwhile, the East India Company tightened its grip on India. What had begun as trade had become dominion. British officials, merchants turned governors, ruled territories as large as kingdoms. Indian princes bowed to London's power, and the subcontinent's wealth flowed into British banks. Tea from Assam, spices from Calcutta, textiles from Bombay, these were the treasures of empire. But the price was heavy. Famines ravaged the poor, and resentment simmered under the polished veneer of imperial rule. Still, to the world, Britain's star seemed to shine undimmed. Its navy, rebuilt after the American loss, grew into the most formidable fleet the earth had ever known. Its red-coated soldiers marched not in retreat, but across continents. The empire's new motto, though never spoken aloud, might as well have been carved into stone. Never again will we be undone by rebellion. And yet, rebellion was never far away. In Ireland, discontent festered, a centuries-old wound reopened by poverty and religious division. In Scotland, after the failed Jacobite rising, Highland culture was crushed but not forgotten. Even within the empire's heart, there was unease, whispers of reform, of rights, of the people demanding their place in the story. For the loss of America had done something profound to Britain's soul. It had humbled it, but it had also awakened it. No longer could the empire rest on old certainties. It had to evolve. So the 18th century gave way to the 19th, not with the sound of cannons but with the hum of progress. The Royal Society pushed the boundaries of science. The abolitionist movement, led by figures like William Wilberforce, began to challenge the moral core of empire, crying out against the inhumanity of slavery. The conscience of Britain was stirring, uneasy, divided, but alive. And even as London grew rich on trade and industry, its thinkers began to ask whether power without justice could ever last. Still, the sea remained Britain's greatest ally. Its navy was the heartbeat of empire, protecting trade routes, deterring rivals, enforcing British will on distant shores. The lessons of America had made it cautious, strategic, and above all, determined. Across the world, flags changed, alliances shifted, but Britain endured. The empire, forged from loss and ambition, was becoming something more than a collection of colonies. It was becoming a system, a global web of commerce, culture, and control. And in that web, power and principle wrestled like twin serpents. Out of the shadow of Yorktown, Britain had built a new foundation, one that looked not backward toward lost colonies, but forward toward an empire of unmatched reach. From Cape Town to Calcutta, from the Caribbean to Canada, the British flag once again rose, not as a symbol of repentance, but of renewal. Defeat had taught Britain its greatest lesson, that empires do not end when they lose land, they end when they lose purpose. And so from the ashes of rebellion, the empire found its next purpose, to rule, to reform, and to reshape the world in its own image. The king's ships were already sailing again, the factories roared, the colonies expanded. And on the horizon a new challenge began to rise, a man across the channel whose shadow would soon stretch over all of Europe. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, and his ambition would test Britain's survival once more, not in the forests of America, but on the fields of Europe and upon the endless sea itself. The dawn of the 19th century broke not in peace but in thunder. The drums of war echoed across Europe, rolling like distant storms over fields and cities. From Paris to Vienna, from Madrid to Moscow, one name filled the world with awe: Napoleon Bonaparte. He rose like lightning out of the chaos of the French Revolution, a soldier who crowned himself emperor, a conqueror who redrew the map of Europe with fire and ambition. To many he was a hero of progress, to others a tyrant cloaked in glory. But to Britain he was something else entirely, the single greatest threat the island kingdom had ever faced. Once, England had feared the might of Spain, the wrath of Rome, or the rebellion of its colonies. Now it faced a force that sought to command the entire continent. Napoleon's armies marched in perfect rhythm, their eagles glinting in the sun. Nations fell before him like dominoes: Austria, Prussia, Italy, each brought to heel beneath his vision of empire. But Britain stood apart. Separated by a strip of restless sea, it became the one fortress Napoleon could not take. And so began a war not of continents, but of endurance, fought in boardrooms and battlefields, in oceans and deserts, in the hearts of men. The British understood one truth Napoleon did not: while empires of land may rise, empires of sea endure. The Royal Navy, rebuilt after the losses of the American Revolution, had become the beating heart of Britain's power. Its ships, clad in oak and iron, ruled the waves like floating fortresses. The sea, long Britain's defense, now became its weapon. It was the year 1805, and the world held its breath. Off the coast of Spain, near Cape Trafalgar, the French and Spanish fleets joined forces to break Britain's naval dominance once and for all. Waiting for them was Admiral Horatio Nelson aboard his flagship Victory, his heart burning with duty. Nelson was more than a sailor. He was the embodiment of Britain's spirit, brave, flawed, fiercely devoted. As the cannons roared and the smoke thickened, he led his fleet straight into the enemy line, breaking their formation in two. The battle raged for hours, thunder and flame upon the water. When it was done, the French fleet was shattered. Nelson, struck by a sniper's bullet, was carried below deck. His last words were simple: "Thank God I have done my duty." He died as the sea fell silent, and with his death, Britain's naval supremacy became eternal. Trafalgar was more than victory. It was immortality. With the seas secured, Britain turned its gaze back to the continent. Napoleon's empire stretched from the Atlantic to the Russian steppes, but Britain refused to yield. Instead of meeting him head-on, it fought with patience, funding coalitions, arming allies, and turning the global economy into a weapon. Gold from London fueled armies in Austria, Prussia, and Russia. The British strategy was simple: If Napoleon conquered the land, Britain would control everything else. And so the wars raged on, the Napoleonic Wars, a conflict that engulfed a generation. In Spain, British soldiers under Arthur Wellesley, later known as the Duke of Wellington, joined local resistance forces in the Peninsular War. It was brutal, fought in mountains and villages, but it slowly bled Napoleon's empire dry. While muskets cracked in Europe, Britain's empire continued to expand elsewhere. The East India Company, emboldened by victory and wealth, extended its dominion across India. The Royal Navy struck at French colonies in Africa and the Caribbean, cutting off Napoleon's reach around the globe. Britain was not just surviving, it was transforming war into empire. At home, the streets of London throbbed with life. Newspapers carried news from a dozen fronts. Merchants thrived even in wartime. Factories spun with ceaseless motion, and the new industrial cities became engines of power. The iron and steam that drove industry also built warships and cannons. The age of industrial warfare had begun, and Britain was its master. By 1812, Napoleon's ambitions reached their zenith and their doom. He marched into Russia with 500,000 men, determined to crush his last rival. But winter, hunger, and the vastness of the land broke him. When his army staggered back from Moscow, it was a ghost of its former self. Sensing the end, Britain moved swiftly. Wellington advanced from Spain, and the great powers of Europe closed in. At Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, Napoleon's empire began to crumble. By 1814, Paris had fallen, and the emperor was forced into exile on the island of Elba. But history rarely ends so neatly. Within a year, Napoleon escaped, returning to France to reclaim his throne. Europe trembled once more. The old alliances reformed, and Wellington's army prepared for one last confrontation. It came at a small village in Belgium, Waterloo, June 1815. The sky was heavy with rain, the ground thick with mud. Cannons thundered, cavalry charged, muskets flared through the smoke. For hours the battle swayed back and forth. At last the Prussians arrived to aid the British, and Napoleon's line broke. His army collapsed. His dream of empire died beneath the hooves of Wellington's horses. As the sun set over the bloodied field, Britain stood victorious, weary, scarred, but unbroken. The wars that had consumed Europe for 20 years were finally over. The map of the world had changed, and Britain's position within it was absolute. The Congress of Vienna, held soon after, sought to restore order to Europe. Yet beneath the polished diplomacy, one truth was clear. Britain had emerged as the world's dominant power. Its navy controlled the seas, its colonies spanned continents, its industrial might was unmatched. And unlike Napoleon's empire, which had burned bright and fast, Britain's was built to last. Peace, however, did not bring rest. The cost of victory was immense. Thousands dead, fortunes spent, cities strained. But war had also given Britain something intangible: momentum. The factories kept running. The ships kept sailing. The ambition that had defeated Napoleon now turned outward again, toward Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. This new phase of empire would be quieter, subtler, and far more enduring. It would not rely solely on war, but on commerce, diplomacy, and culture. Britain no longer sought just to conquer, it sought to connect, to turn the world into a single network of trade and influence, with London at its center. But not everyone saw this as glory. Within Britain itself, voices began to rise, questioning the cost of empire, the morality of its reach, and the suffering it often brought. Even so, the empire pressed forward. When Napoleon was finally exiled to the lonely island of St. Helena, the world seemed smaller. The seas were no longer barriers but highways. The sun never set on the Union Jack, and for the first time in history, one nation stood above all others, master of oceans, trade, and industry alike. From the misted cliffs of Dover to the ports of Bombay and Cape Town, a single story was being written, one of power, progress, and paradox. The wars had forged not just victory, but destiny. Britain had stared into the storm of revolution and survived. Now it would seek to shape the world in its image, not through fire alone, but through faith, money, and invention. Yet, as every empire must learn, dominance is never peace. The world was changing, faster than any monarch or general could grasp. Machines were reshaping labor, factories were remaking cities. People were beginning to ask whether the empire's greatness was built for all or for only a few. For now, though, the drums were silent, the cannons cooled, and across the globe, Britain's banners fluttered in the wind, symbols not just of triumph, but of transformation. The war was over, and the empire had survived. But in surviving, it had become something far larger than any king or soldier could ever have imagined. It had become an idea that would shine and shadow the next century to come. The year was 1815, and Europe finally exhaled. After 2 decades of war, the cannons were silent, the fields green again. From the ruins of empire and revolution, Britain emerged not just victorious, but unchallenged. The seas, once filled with rivals, now belonged to her alone. And as her ship sailed beneath calm skies, a new era began. An era history would later call the Pax Britannica, the British peace. But peace for Britain did not mean rest. It meant rule. The empire stretched across the world like a living map, red and gold on parchment, smoke and sail in reality. From the icy shores of Canada to the warm winds of the Caribbean, from the deserts of Arabia to the jungles of India, Britain's influence reached further than any kingdom before it. The saying spread, "The sun never sets on the British Empire." For a century, that would be almost true. At home, London became the heart of the world, the capital of capitals. Its docks bustled day and night, receiving ships from every ocean. Sugar, tea, silk, opium, cotton and gold flowed through its markets. In the flickering lamplight, clerks counted fortunes. Inventors dreamed of iron and steam. Poets and painters imagined the empire's glory in verse and color. And yet beneath the hum of progress, something more profound was happening. The world itself was shrinking. The Industrial Revolution, born in British soil, was now transforming the planet. Steamships cut across oceans faster than the wind. Railways stitched continents together. Telegraph cables carried words at the speed of thought. The empire was no longer just a collection of colonies. It was becoming a system, a network of trade, communication and power, all humming in rhythm to the beat of Britain's heart. To the victors of Trafalgar and Waterloo, this seemed divine destiny. The empire believed itself not merely powerful, but purposeful. Its thinkers, like Thomas Macaulay and John Stuart Mill, spoke of the civilizing mission, the belief that British rule brought progress to the world. Schools were built, laws were written. The English language began to echo in the courts of India, the markets of Africa, and the ports of China. But behind that lofty vision lay contradictions too vast to ignore. The wealth that built London's palaces often came from the sweat of faraway labourers. The peace that blessed Britain was not always shared by those beneath its flag. The cotton that clothed its people was grown by others in chains. The empire's glory was brilliant, but uneven. Still, for much of the 19th century, it seemed eternal. Queen Victoria, who ascended the throne in 1837, became its symbol. Young, determined, endlessly dutiful. Her image, serene and constant, adorned coins, portraits and hearts. She was more than a monarch. She was the embodiment of empire, steady in an age of speed, moral in an age of ambition. Under her reign, Britain's influence reached its zenith. The Royal Navy patrolled every major waterway. The empire's colonies numbered in the dozens. Its trade routes connected every continent. Peace, or at least the appearance of it, covered vast parts of the world, enforced by the silent threat of British guns. It was an age of exploration, too. Adventurers crossed the Arctic ice and African deserts. David Livingstone sought the sources of the Nile. Charles Darwin, sailing aboard the Beagle, studied life in the Galapagos and returned with ideas that would change humanity's understanding of itself. The empire was not just a machine of commerce, it was also a crucible of discovery. But even the grandest empires have shadows. In Ireland, famine struck in the 1840s. Potatoes failed, harvests rotted, and millions starved. British aid was slow, inadequate, and bureaucratic. Ships laden with food left Irish ports even as corpses filled the roadsides. The tragedy would scar the relationship between Ireland and Britain for generations and reveal the dark edge of imperial indifference. Across the seas, unrest brewed in India. The East India Company, having conquered vast territories, ruled with both bureaucratic precision and cultural arrogance. Indian soldiers, sepoys, served in the company's armies, but resentment grew over taxes, land seizures, and religious offences. In 1857, that resentment exploded into flame. The Indian Rebellion, or the First War of Independence as it is also known, shook the empire to its core. Towns rose in revolt. British officers and civilians were killed. Retribution followed with equal cruelty. Villages burned, blood soaked the Ganges plains, and both sides committed unspeakable acts. When the smoke cleared, the East India Company was no more. India passed directly under the rule of the British Crown, and Queen Victoria became Empress of India. To the British, it was an assertion of control. To Indians, it was the tightening of chains. And yet, paradoxically, this period of conquest also birthed the seeds of resistance. Educated in English schools, Indian thinkers and reformers began to speak the language of liberty, the very ideals Britain claimed to represent. One day, those words would come back to challenge the empire itself. Meanwhile, at home, the Industrial Revolution reached its full stride. Steam engines drove locomotives across the countryside. Factories belched smoke into the skies of Manchester and Birmingham. The Great Exhibition of 1851, held inside the glittering Crystal Palace, showcased the empire's might. Inventions from every corner of the globe displayed under one glass roof. It was a celebration of human progress, but also a statement: the empire rules the modern age. And yet, for all its grandeur, cracks were beginning to form. Workers in Britain's cities lived in poverty, their labour enriching others. Reformers like Charles Dickens wrote of child labour, debtors' prisons, and the cruelty of progress without compassion. Across the empire, colonies grew restless, each wondering how long peace could endure under the weight of injustice. Even so, Victoria's empire seemed untouchable. Its railways carried goods and soldiers to every port. Its navy kept rivals, France, Russia, even the newly unified Germany, in check. Britain had become not just a power, but the power. This balance, this illusion of perpetual peace, defined the mid-19th century. It was an age of control, of borders drawn in ink, of treaties signed in gilded halls, of distant lands mapped and claimed by men who had never walked their soil. And yet somewhere deep within that system, the world was shifting again. The same industrial might that gave Britain dominance now gave rise to new challengers. America, rebuilt after its own civil war, was growing fast. Germany, newly united, was building ships and factories of its own. The world that Britain ruled in comfort was about to become crowded. Still, for the moment, the Pax Britannica endured. It was a century without rival, of explorers and engineers, of poets and queens, of peace enforced by empire. In the streets of London, the air was thick with smoke and promise. The gas lamps flickered along the Thames. In drawing rooms, people spoke of moral duty and progress. In taverns, sailors told stories of ports half a world away. The empire seemed endless, eternal, unshakable. But history is never still. The same engines that drove prosperity also drove hunger, for land, for markets, for glory. Beneath the calm surface of Pax Britannica, new storms were gathering. Nationalism in Europe, rebellion in the colonies, competition on the seas. Britain's peace was not the peace of equality. It was the peace of dominance, and dominance never lasts forever. For now, though, the empire basked in its golden light. The Queen's Jubilee celebrations filled the air with music and banners. The world bowed, or seemed to bow. The red on the map glowed bright and wide, and the sun still refused to set. But beyond that horizon, just past the calm, the future waited, and it would not remain silent for long. The dawn of the 19th century broke not in peace but in thunder. The drums of war echoed across Europe, rolling like distant storms over fields and cities. From Paris to Vienna, from Madrid to Moscow, one name filled the world with awe: Napoleon Bonaparte. He rose like lightning out of the chaos of the French Revolution, a soldier who crowned himself emperor, a conqueror who redrew the map of Europe with fire and ambition. To many, he was a hero of progress. To others, a tyrant cloaked in glory. But to Britain he was something else entirely, the single greatest threat the island kingdom had ever faced. Once, England had feared the might of Spain, the wrath of Rome, or the rebellion of its colonies. Now it faced a force that sought to command the entire continent. Napoleon's armies marched in perfect rhythm, their eagles glinting in the sun. Nations fell before him like dominoes: Austria, Prussia, Italy, each brought to heel beneath his vision of empire. But Britain stood apart. Separated by a strip of restless sea, it became the one fortress Napoleon could not take. And so began a war not of continents, but of endurance, fought in boardrooms and battlefields, in oceans and deserts, in the hearts of men. The British understood one truth Napoleon did not. While empires of land may rise, empires of sea endure. The Royal Navy, rebuilt after the losses of the American Revolution, had become the beating heart of Britain's power. Its ships, clad in oak and iron, ruled the waves like floating fortresses. The sea, long Britain's defense, now became its weapon. It was the year 1805 and the world held its breath. Off the coast of Spain near Cape Trafalgar, the French and Spanish fleets joined forces to break Britain's naval dominance once and for all. Waiting for them was Admiral Horatio Nelson, aboard his flagship Victory, his heart burning with duty. Nelson was more than a sailor. He was the embodiment of Britain's spirit, brave, flawed, fiercely devoted. As the cannons roared and the smoke thickened, he led his fleet straight into the enemy line, breaking their formation in two. The battle raged for hours, thunder and flame upon the water. When it was done, the French fleet was shattered. Nelson, struck by a sniper's bullet, was carried below deck. His last words were simple: "Thank God I have done my duty." He died as the sea fell silent, and with his death, Britain's naval supremacy became eternal. Trafalgar was more than victory. It was immortality. With the seas secured, Britain turned its gaze back to the continent. Napoleon's empire stretched from the Atlantic to the Russian steppes, but Britain refused to yield. Instead of meeting him head-on, it fought with patience, funding coalitions, arming allies, and turning the global economy into a weapon. Gold from London fueled armies in Austria, Prussia, and Russia. The British strategy was simple: if Napoleon conquered the land, Britain would control everything else. And so the wars raged on, the Napoleonic Wars, a conflict that engulfed a generation. In Spain, British soldiers under Arthur Wellesley, later known as the Duke of Wellington, joined local resistance forces in the Peninsular War. It was brutal, fought in mountains and villages, but it slowly bled Napoleon's empire dry. While muskets cracked in Europe, Britain's empire continued to expand elsewhere. The East India Company, emboldened by victory and wealth, extended its dominion across India. The Royal Navy struck at French colonies in Africa and the Caribbean, cutting off Napoleon's reach around the globe. Britain was not just surviving, it was transforming war into empire. At home, the streets of London throbbed with life. Newspapers carried news from a dozen fronts. Merchants thrived even in wartime. Factories spun with ceaseless motion, and the new industrial cities became engines of power. The iron and steam that drove industry also built warships and cannons. The age of industrial warfare had begun, and Britain was its master. By 1812, Napoleon's ambitions reached their zenith and their doom. He marched into Russia with 500,000 men, determined to crush his last rival. But winter, hunger, and the vastness of the land broke him. When his army staggered back from Moscow, it was a ghost of its former self. Sensing the end, Britain moved swiftly. Wellington advanced from Spain and the great powers of Europe closed in. At Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, Napoleon's empire began to crumble. By 1814, Paris had fallen, and the emperor was forced into exile on the island of Elba. But history rarely ends so neatly. Within a year, Napoleon escaped, returning to France to reclaim his throne. Europe trembled once more. The old alliances reformed, and Wellington's army prepared for one last confrontation. It came at a small village in Belgium, Waterloo, June 1815. The sky was heavy with rain, the ground thick with mud. Cannons thundered, cavalry charged, muskets flared through the smoke. For hours, The battles swayed back and forth. At last, the Prussians arrived to aid the British and Napoleon's line broke. His army collapsed. His dream of empire died beneath the hooves of Wellington's horses. As the sun set over the bloodied field, Britain stood victorious, weary, scarred but unbroken. The wars that had consumed Europe for 20 years were finally over. The map of the world had changed, and Britain's position within it was absolute. The Congress of Vienna, held soon after, sought to restore order to Europe. Yet beneath the polished diplomacy, one truth was clear. Britain had emerged as the world's dominant power. Its navy controlled the seas. Its colonies spanned continents. Its industrial might was unmatched. And unlike Napoleon's empire, which had burned bright and fast, Britain's was built to last. Peace, however, did not bring rest. The cost of victory was immense. Thousands dead, fortunes spent, cities strained. But war had also given Britain something intangible: momentum. The factories kept running. The ships kept sailing. The ambition that had defeated Napoleon now turned outward again, toward Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. This new phase of empire would be quieter, subtler, and far more enduring. It would not rely solely on war, but on commerce, diplomacy, and culture. Britain no longer sought just to conquer, it sought to connect. To turn the world into a single network of trade and influence, with London at its center. But not everyone saw this as glory. Within Britain itself, voices began to rise, questioning the cost of empire, the morality of its reach, and the suffering it often brought. Even so, the empire pressed forward. When Napoleon was finally exiled to the lonely island of St. Helena, the world seemed smaller. The seas were no longer barriers but highways. The sun never set on the Union Jack, and for the first time in history, one nation stood above all others, master of oceans, trade, and industry alike. From the misted cliffs of Dover to the ports of Bombay and Cape Town, a single story was being written, one of power, progress, and paradox. The wars had forged not just victory, but destiny. Britain had stared into the storm of revolution and survived. Now it would seek to shape the world in its image, not through fire alone, but through faith, money, and invention. Yet, as every empire must learn, dominance is never peace. The world was changing, faster than any monarch or general could grasp. Machines were reshaping labor, factories were remaking cities. People were beginning to ask whether the empire's greatness was built for all or for only a few. For now, though, the drums were silent, the cannons cooled, and across the globe, Britain's banners fluttered in the wind, symbols not just of triumph but of transformation. The war was over, and the empire had survived. But in surviving, it had become something far larger than any king or soldier could ever have imagined. It had become an idea that would shine and shadow the next century to come. The year was 1815, and Europe finally exhaled. After 2 decades of war, the cannons were silent, the fields green again. From the ruins of empire and revolution, Britain emerged not just victorious, but unchallenged. The seas, once filled with rivals, now belonged to her alone. And as her ships sailed beneath calm skies, a new era began, an era history would later call the Pax Britannica, the British peace. But peace, for Britain, did not mean rest. It meant rule. The empire stretched across the world like a living map, red and gold on parchment, smoke and sail in reality. From the icy shores of Canada to the warm winds of the Caribbean, from the deserts of Arabia to the jungles of India, Britain's influence reached further than any kingdom before it. The saying spread, "The sun never sets on the British Empire." For a century, that would be almost true. At home, London became the heart of the world, the capital of capitals. Its docks bustled day and night, receiving ships from every ocean. Sugar, tea, silk, opium, cotton, and gold flowed through its markets. In the flickering lamplight, clerks counted fortunes, inventors dreamed of iron and steam, poets and painters imagined the empire's glory in verse and color. And yet, beneath the hum of progress, something more profound was happening. The world itself was shrinking. The Industrial Revolution, born in British soil, was now transforming the planet. Steamships cut across oceans faster than the wind. Railways stitched continents together. Telegraph cables carried words at the speed of thought. The empire was no longer just a collection of colonies. It was becoming a system, a network of trade, communication, and power, all humming in rhythm to the beat of Britain's heart. To the victors of Trafalgar and Waterloo, this seemed divine destiny. The empire believed itself not merely powerful, but purposeful. Its thinkers, like Thomas Macaulay and John Stuart Mill, spoke of the civilizing mission, the belief that British rule brought progress to the world. Schools were built, laws were written. The English language began to echo in the courts of India, the markets of Africa, and the ports of China. But behind that lofty vision lay contradictions too vast to ignore. The wealth that built London's palaces often came from the sweat of faraway labourers. The peace that blessed Britain was not always shared by those beneath its flag. The cotton that clothed its people was grown by others in chains. The empire's glory was brilliant, but uneven. Still, for much of the 19th century, it seemed eternal. Queen Victoria, who ascended the throne in 1837, became its symbol. Young, determined, endlessly dutiful. Her image, serene and constant, adorned coins, portraits, and hearts. She was more than a monarch. She was the embodiment of empire, steady in an age of speed, moral in an age of ambition. Under her reign, Britain's influence reached its zenith. The Royal Navy patrolled every major waterway. The empire's colonies numbered in the dozens. Its trade routes connected every continent. Peace, or at least the appearance of it, covered vast parts of the world, enforced by the silent threat of British guns. It was an age of exploration, too. Adventurers crossed the Arctic ice and African deserts. David Livingstone sought the sources of the Nile. Charles Darwin, sailing aboard the Beagle, studied life in the Galapagos and returned with ideas that would change humanity's understanding of itself. The empire was not just a machine of commerce, it was also a crucible of discovery. But even the grandest empires have shadows. In Ireland, famine struck in the 1840s. Potatoes failed, harvests rotted, and millions starved. British aid was slow, inadequate, and bureaucratic. Ships laden with food left Irish ports even as corpses filled the roadsides. The tragedy would scar the relationship between Ireland and Britain for generations and reveal the dark edge of imperial indifference. Across the seas, unrest brewed in India. The East India Company, having conquered vast territories, ruled with both bureaucratic precision and cultural arrogance. Indian soldiers, sepoys, served in the company's armies, but resentment grew over taxes, land seizures, and religious offences. In 1857, that resentment exploded into flame. The Indian Rebellion, or the First War of Independence, as it is also known, shook the empire to its core. Towns rose in revolt. British officers and civilians were killed. Retribution followed with equal cruelty. Villages burned, blood soaked the Ganges plains, and both sides committed unspeakable acts. When the smoke cleared, the East India Company was no more. India passed directly under the rule of the British Crown, and Queen Victoria became Empress of India. To the British, it was an assertion of control. To Indians, it was the tightening of chains. And yet, paradoxically, this period of conquest also birthed the seeds of resistance. Educated in English schools, Indian thinkers and reformers began to speak the language of liberty, the very ideals Britain claimed to represent. One day those words would come back to challenge the empire itself. Meanwhile, at home, the Industrial Revolution reached its full stride. Steam engines drove locomotives across the countryside. Factories belched smoke into the skies of Manchester and Birmingham. The Great Exhibition of 1851, held inside the glittering Crystal Palace, showcased the empire's might inventions from every corner of the globe, displayed under one glass roof. It was a celebration of human progress, but also a statement. The empire rules the modern age. And yet, for all its grandeur, cracks were beginning to form. Workers in Britain's cities lived in poverty, their labour enriching others. Reformers like Charles Dickens wrote of child labour, debtors' prisons, and the cruelty of progress without compassion. Across the empire, colonies grew restless, each wondering how long peace could endure under the weight of injustice. Even so, Victoria's empire seemed untouchable. Its railways carried goods and soldiers to every port. Its navy kept rivals, France, Russia, even the newly unified Germany, in check. Britain had become not just a power, but the power. This balance, this illusion of perpetual peace, defined the mid-19th century. It was an age of control, of borders drawn in ink, of treaties signed in gilded halls, of distant lands mapped and claimed by men who had never walked their soil. And yet somewhere deep within that system, the world was shifting again. The same industrial might that gave Britain dominance now gave rise to new challenges. America, rebuilt after its own civil war, was growing fast. Germany, newly united, was building ships and factories of its own. The world that Britain ruled in comfort was about to become crowded. Still, for the moment, the Pax Britannica endured. It was a century without rival, of explorers and engineers, of poets and queens, of peace enforced by empire. In the streets of London, the air was thick with smoke and promise. The gas lamps flickered along the Thames. In drawing rooms, people spoke of moral duty and progress. In taverns, sailors told stories of ports half a world away. The empire seemed endless, eternal, unshakable. But history is never still. The same engines that drove prosperity also drove hunger, for land, for markets, for glory. Beneath the calm surface of Pax Britannica, new storms were gathering. Nationalism in Europe, rebellion in the colonies, competition on the seas. Britain's peace was not the peace of equality, it was the peace of dominance, and dominance never lasts forever. For now, though, the empire basked in its golden light. The Queen's Jubilee celebrations filled the air with music and banners. The world bowed, or seemed to bow. The red on the map glowed bright and wide, and the sun still refused to set. But beyond that horizon, just past the calm, the future waited, and it would not remain silent for long. The summer of 1914 began in warmth and light. Across Britain, the parks were full, the factories busy, the newspapers filled with stories of progress, new ships, new machines, new discoveries. The empire, vast and glittering, seemed to stand at the height of its power. The seas were calm, the trade routes safe. The British believed themselves masters of the modern age. And then, a single gunshot in Sarajevo shattered the illusion. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary set in motion a chain of alliances and hatreds that had been tightening for years. Europe, bound by pride and paranoia, plunged toward war like a machine without a break. Within weeks, the world was engulfed. When Britain declared war on Germany on August 4, 1914, crowds filled the streets of London, waving flags and singing patriotic songs. Young men lined up to enlist, imagining glory, adventure, and the defense of civilization. No one yet understood what kind of war it would be. They called it the Great War, believing it would be over by Christmas. It would last 4 years and change the world forever. The empire answered Britain's call. From every corner of its vast domain, soldiers came. Canadians from the snow, Australians from the outback, Indians from the Punjab, Africans from the veldt. They came in millions, sailing across oceans to fight in lands they had never seen for a king they had never met. The battlefields of Europe became oceans of mud and fire. The war was unlike anything before, a conflict not of cavalry and honor, but of machines and misery. The machine gun, the tank, the airplane, and the gas shell turned heroism into survival. At Ypres, Verdun, the Somme, and Passchendaele, men fought and died for inches of ground. The earth itself seemed to bleed, craters filled with rain, the air thick with smoke, and the cries of the wounded. The Empire's sons, from Manchester to Melbourne, stood shoulder to shoulder in trenches that stretched for miles, their faces caked in mud, their eyes hollowed by months of shell fire. Britain's industrial might fed the war. Its factories turned from engines to ammunition, its shipyards from trade to troop transport. Women took up work in the mills and hospitals, their hands stained with oil and courage. They became the Empire's silent army, keeping the wheels of war turning while the men fought abroad. But the cost was unbearable. By 1916, the optimism of that first summer was gone. Casualties mounted by the millions. The Battle of the Somme alone claimed over 1 million lives for a few miles of devastated earth. Letters from the front filled with phrases like, "I am still alive," and "The guns never stop." At home, rationing began. Food was scarce, prices rose, and black cloth hung in windows for the dead. Yet through it all, the empire endured. The Royal Navy kept the seas open, and colonies across the globe poured resources and men into the cause. India sent over 1 million soldiers. Canada's regiments distinguished themselves at Vimy Ridge. Australians fought bravely at Gallipoli, in a campaign that ended in tragedy but forged national identity. By 1917, the war's weight was breaking the world. Russia fell into revolution. The United States, once neutral, joined the fight on the side of the Allies. The tide began to turn, but the cost was staggering. And then, in 1918, it ended. Suddenly, almost without fanfare, the German army, exhausted and starving, collapsed. The Kaiser fled. On November 11th, the guns fell silent. Across Britain and its empire, bells rang. Crowds wept and cheered, but beneath the relief was something hollow. The war had taken nearly 1 million British lives, and countless more from the colonies. An entire generation was gone. Victory felt like loss. In London, the soldiers returned, limping, broken, faces pale beneath the soot of years. The parades were grand, but the silence that followed was heavier still. For the first time in memory, the empire looked inward and saw not triumph but trauma. The war had changed everything. Empires across Europe fell: the Ottoman, the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian and the German. Only Britain survived. But it was not the same empire that had entered the war. The cost of victory had weakened its foundations. The colonies that had fought so bravely began to ask new questions. India's soldiers had bled for Britain. Now they demanded respect and representation. The Indian National Congress, once a forum for polite reform, grew louder, bolder. Leaders like Mohandas Gandhi, returning from South Africa, began to speak of Swaraj, self-rule. In Ireland, long restless under British rule, rebellion broke into the open. The Easter Rising of 1916, though crushed, had ignited a movement that would not die. By 1921, Ireland would be divided, the South free, the North still British. Even within Britain, the social order trembled. The war had blurred the lines between classes. The working poor had fought beside the sons of aristocrats. Women, who had labored in factories and hospitals, now demanded the right to vote. In 1918, many of them finally won it. The old world, the Victorian world of empire, certainty and hierarchy, had been buried in the trenches. And yet, for all its wounds, Britain tried to rebuild. The 1920s dawned in exhaustion and relief. The League of Nations, born from President Wilson's dream of peace, seemed to promise that such horror would never come again. Britain, still mighty, became a global mediator. Its empire expanded even further, taking control of territories once held by the defeated Central Powers. At its height, the British Empire now governed over 400 million people across a quarter of the globe. But this was not an empire of confidence. It was an empire haunted by memory, of the dead, of the lost, of the unspoken fear that such peace could not last. The war had also shifted power in ways unseen. The United States had risen as a new world power. The balance of the seas, once entirely British, was now shared. The financial heart of the world began to drift from London to New York. The empire still glittered, but its light no longer blazed. And beneath that glitter, the first whispers of discontent grew louder. In Africa, intellectuals and soldiers who had served in the war began to question why they fought for freedom abroad when they had none at home. In the Middle East, promises made during the war of independence, of self-determination, were broken as Britain and France divided the former Ottoman lands into new mandates. The maps changed again, but the old arrogance remained. At home, the empire celebrated peace with memorials and ceremonies. The tomb of the unknown soldier in Westminster Abbey became a shrine to grief too large for names. On Armistice Day, the streets filled with poppies and silence, a nation remembering not victory but sacrifice. Still, the 1920s brought flickers of renewal. Jazz filled the halls of London, airplanes crossed the Channel, radios hummed with distant voices. The empire seemed to breathe again, even as its heart remained bruised. But history rarely allows recovery without consequence. The Great War had been called The war to end all wars, yet the peace that followed was fragile, built on debt, disillusionment, and denial. Across Europe, old empires crumbled into new, uncertain nations. In Germany, bitterness festered beneath the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles. In Italy, a man named Mussolini rose, preaching power and nationalism. The storm that had once engulfed the world was not gone. It was only waiting. Britain did not know it yet, but the generation it had sacrificed for peace would soon be followed by another one that would fight once again for the survival of everything the empire claimed to stand for. For now, though, the guns were silent. The red poppies bloomed over the graves of millions. The empire still stood, weary, uncertain, and forever changed. The world had entered the modern age, but it had left its innocence behind in the mud of Flanders. And the British Empire, once unshakable, would never be the same again. The guns had fallen silent, yet the echo of the Great War lingered in every street, every family, every heart. Britain had won, but victory came dressed in mourning black. In every town, memorials rose like stone prayers, inscribed with names upon names. The empire stood larger than ever before, its red hue covering a quarter of the globe, but its soul was tired. The 1920s began not with triumph, but with reckoning. The empire had to rebuild a world that no longer believed in the old certainties. The war had shaken faith, in monarchs, in generals, in God himself. The illusions of eternal order and progress had drowned in the trenches of the Somme. In London, the streets still gleamed with the empire's wealth. The palaces, the banks, the docks humming with trade. Yet behind the marble facades, anxiety grew. The war had cost Britain not just blood, but treasure. Its gold reserves were depleted, its debts staggering. America, once the empire's upstart child, had emerged rich, confident, and ascendant. The financial capital of the world, once unchallenged in London, now tilted toward New York. Across Britain, men returned to jobs that no longer existed. Factories closed. Coal miners, dock workers, and railwaymen demanded fair wages. Strikes erupted like lightning storms. In 1926, Britain faced its greatest domestic paralysis, the general strike. For 9 tense days, the country ground to a halt. Trains stopped, newspapers ceased, lights went out in cities that once illuminated the world. The empire's heartbeat stuttered, and yet amidst uncertainty, a fragile hope bloomed, a belief that modernity might heal what war had broken. Automobiles began to hum down cobblestone streets. Radios carried voices across oceans. Jazz spilled from London clubs, bright and reckless. Women newly enfranchised walked with purpose and freedom unknown before. The 1920s were a contradiction, grief beneath glitter, optimism shadowed by exhaustion. Beyond Britain's shores, the empire stretched wider than ever. The League of Nations entrusted it with new mandates, former Ottoman territories in the Middle East. Palestine, Iraq, and Transjordan came under British control. In theory, these lands were to be guided towards self-rule. In truth, they became new pieces in the empire's global puzzle. Pipelines and trade routes mattered more than promises of independence. In India, the war had awakened something powerful and irreversible. Over 1 million Indians had fought for the empire. Tens of thousands had died. In return, they expected dignity, perhaps even freedom. Instead, they received bullets. In 1919, British troops under General Dyer opened fire on peaceful protesters in Amritsar, killing hundreds. The Amritsar massacre sent shockwaves through the world. The Raj's moral mask cracked. Out of that wound rose a quiet man in a simple dhoti, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. He spoke softly, but his words carried the weight of centuries. He called for non-violence, for truth, for Swaraj, self-rule. His salt marches, boycotts, and fasts became a spiritual rebellion. Across villages and cities, millions began to dream of an India free from foreign rule. Britain did not yet understand that the empire's foundation had begun to shift. Elsewhere, the colonies whispered their own dreams. In Egypt, protests forced Britain to grant nominal independence in 1922, though the Suez Canal remained under British control. In Africa, soldiers and students who had served in Europe began to question why liberty was reserved for some. and denied to others. In Ireland, the price of peace had been division, the birth of the Irish Free State, and the lingering tension of a partitioned Ireland. The empire was still mighty, but the ground beneath it trembled with change. The late 1920s brought a strange, uneasy calm, a fragile illusion of stability. But far across the Atlantic in 1929, a storm began to brew that would not respect oceans or empires. The Wall Street crash shattered global markets. Banks collapsed, trade froze. The Great Depression swept the world like a shadow tide. Britain, already burdened by debt, felt the tremor deeply. Unemployment soared. Hunger returned to industrial cities. The promise of the modern world cracked like glass. To survive, Britain turned inward, tightening control over its empire. Colonial economies were forced to serve the needs of the motherland: cotton from India, sugar from the Caribbean, gold from South Africa. It was an unspoken bargain. In return for order, colonies would bear the weight of Britain's recovery. But in doing so, the empire seeded resentment. In India, Gandhi returned to the forefront, defying British salt taxes with a march that captured the world's attention. In Africa, labor movements stirred beneath the surface. In the Middle East, uprisings flared against imperial rule and broken promises. The empire could no longer pretend to be a family. It was a hierarchy, struggling to hold its shape. Meanwhile, in Europe, the old wounds of the Great War festered. The Treaty of Versailles, meant to secure peace, had humiliated Germany. In the bitterness of economic ruin and national humiliation, new voices rose, angry, theatrical, and dangerous. In Italy, Mussolini's fascists paraded under black banners, promising power and pride. In Germany, a failed artist with a voice like thunder, Adolf Hitler, found his audience. He spoke of destiny, revenge, and racial purity. The world, weary of democracy's chaos, began to listen to tyrants. Britain watched uneasily. It still possessed the largest navy on earth, the most sprawling empire in history, yet its people feared another war more than anything. They had buried too many sons in the mud of Flanders. The memory of 1914 still haunted every home. And so Britain looked away as fascism rose. It sought compromise, hoping peace could be preserved by reason, by treaties, by hope alone. At the same time, within Britain, something subtle was changing. The empire no longer felt eternal. It felt borrowed. The colonies were no longer simply territories. They were nations in waiting. The air of divine right was fading, replaced by the quiet sense that history itself was shifting toward equality, toward independence. Yet even as the empire's authority weakened, its culture spread more deeply than ever. English became the world's language of commerce, literature, and diplomacy. London remained a magnet for artists, thinkers, and exiles. The BBC's radio waves reached the farthest corners of the world, whispering Britain's voice into 1,000 tongues. And in that voice there was both majesty and melancholy. The 1930s unfolded like a slow tightening of the throat. The Depression dragged on, poverty deepened, and nationalism spread like wildfire across continents. Britain clung to peace while the world edged toward another abyss. When King George V died in 1936, his funeral was a moment of solemn unity, the old empire mourning one of its last steady symbols. But the stability did not last. His successor, Edward VIII, abdicated the throne to marry an American divorcee, shaking the monarchy and embarrassing the establishment. His brother became George VI, the reluctant king, a symbol of endurance for an age about to be tested again. In those quiet years between wars, the empire seemed both immense and fragile. Steamships still crossed oceans bearing goods stamped "Made in Britain." Soldiers still drilled in the tropics. Governors still toasted the king-emperor at colonial banquets. But beneath the rituals, the illusion of permanence was dying. The sun still rose over the empire's farthest frontiers, over the mines of Rhodesia, the plantations of Malaya, the ports of Singapore, and the crowded streets of Calcutta. But somewhere deep within that red glow, a question flickered. How long can this last? For soon the storm would come again, louder, darker, and more terrible than before. A war not just of nations, but of civilizations. A war that would stretch from the skies of London to the jungles of Burma, from the deserts of Egypt to the beaches of Normandy. And when it ended, The empire that entered it would not be the same as the one that came out. But for now, in this brief trembling calm between tempests, the British Empire still stood tall, its banners fluttering in the twilight. The world watched, holding its breath. Because deep down, everyone sensed that history was not finished with Britain yet. The world drifted toward chaos as if in a trance. The Great War had ended just 2 decades before, but the peace it promised was crumbling like dust between trembling fingers. In the heart of Europe, old fears had returned in new uniforms, sharper, prouder, hungrier. The air carried the scent of fire long before the first bombs fell. By 1939, Britain stood once again at the edge of an abyss. It was a different country than the one that had marched to war in 1914, older, scarred, uncertain of its strength. The empire still stretched from the Caribbean to the Pacific, yet it no longer felt immortal. Its people remembered the trenches, the endless lists of names carved into stone, the mourning that had never ended. Still, when Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, and Britain declared war 2 days later, there was no hesitation, only grim resolve. The bells that once rang in triumph now tolled in warning. "We are now at war," said Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, his voice steady but heavy. "For the second time in the lives of most of us, we are called to meet the challenge of a principle which, if it were to prevail, would be fatal to any civilized order." The British Empire, tired, indebted, stretched across oceans, was at war again. And yet, from every corner of that vast red map, voices answered the call. Canadians and Australians, Indians and South Africans, New Zealanders and Kenyans, millions stood ready. The empire, fractured but loyal, would once again stand together against tyranny. At first, it was a war of waiting, the phony war. Britain mobilized but did not move. The radio hummed with speeches, the streets filled with sandbags, and children were evacuated from cities to the countryside. In London, sirens wailed for the first time in a generation, their cry cutting through the fog like ghosts of the past. Then, in the spring of 1940, the storm broke. Hitler's armies swept through Europe with terrifying speed. Denmark, Norway, Belgium, Holland, and finally France fell like dominoes. The world gasped as British troops, trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk, faced annihilation. But from the sea came a miracle. A flotilla of naval ships, fishing boats, and private vessels crossed the channel to rescue them. Nearly 340,000 men were saved. It was not victory, but it was survival, and in survival, hope flickered. That summer, Britain stood alone. The Nazi war machine had conquered the continent. Only the narrow strip of the English Channel separated Hitler from his next prize. Britain's empire, vast but scattered, looked on in dread. If the island fell, the world would follow. Then came the Battle of Britain. Over the fields of southern England, in the blue skies above London and Kent, young pilots took to the air in fragile fighters, Hurricanes and Spitfires to face the Luftwaffe's onslaught. The drone of engines filled the summer air, the horizon lit with trails of smoke and flame. They were so few and so brave. Churchill's words would immortalize them. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Night after night, the Blitz rained destruction upon Britain's cities. London burned, Coventry crumbled, and thousands died beneath the rubble. Yet through the smoke and the sirens, the people endured. Underground stations became shelters, laughter echoing between bomb blasts. The empire's capital refused to bow, and across the oceans, its dominions and colonies rallied. Canada trained pilots and built ships. Australia and New Zealand fought in North Africa. Indian troops marched through the deserts of Libya and the mountains of Burma. African regiments guarded ports and airfields, their sweat and sacrifice unheralded but vital. This was no longer just Britain's war, it was the empire's. A war of nations, races and creeds united not by conquest, but by the desperate need to preserve the last light of freedom. In 1941, the world changed again. In June, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, opening a vast and brutal front in the east. Then in December, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and struck British possessions across Asia, Hong Kong, Malaya, Burma, and Singapore. The Pacific erupted in flame. The fall of Singapore in February 1942 stunned the empire. It had been called the Gibraltar of the East, a fortress believed impregnable. Yet, in a matter of days, it was lost. Over 80,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers were captured. For the first time in modern history, an Asian power had defeated the might of the British Empire. The illusion of invincibility shattered. In India, the shock was profound. If Britain could be beaten, could it still rule? Gandhi and the Indian National Congress demanded independence, launching the Quit India movement in 1942. Britain, desperate for manpower, imprisoned Gandhi but could not silence the growing hunger for freedom. Meanwhile, across Europe and North Africa, the empire fought on. British and Commonwealth forces, under General Montgomery, faced Germany's legendary Field Marshal Rommel in the scorching deserts of El Alamein. The battle, fought under a blood-red sky, marked a turning point. Churchill declared afterward, "Before Alamein we never had a victory. After Alamein we never had a defeat." From that moment the tide began to turn. American industry roared to life. The skies filled with Allied planes, the seas with convoys of ships. Britain, battered but unbroken, became the staging ground for liberation. On June 6, 1944, the greatest armada in history crossed the Channel D-Day. British, Canadian and American soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy under relentless fire. The Empire's sons, men from Bombay to Belfast, from Cape Town to Calgary, fought shoulder to shoulder to reclaim Europe from tyranny. By 1945, the end was near. The cities of Germany lay in ruins. Hitler's Reich, which had once seemed unstoppable, crumbled into ashes. In May, the war in Europe ended. Churchill stood before Parliament and spoke the words the world had waited to hear. "This is your victory. It is the victory of the cause of freedom in every land." But victory came at an unbearable cost. More than 450,000 Britons had died. The Empire's colonies too had paid dearly, their sacrifices often forgotten in the glow of triumph. India had lost over 80,000 soldiers, and countless more had served in silence. Across the empire, cities were scarred, economies shattered, families torn apart. And as Britain celebrated, the world changed again. In August 1945, 2 atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. The war was over, and the modern age had begun, terrifying and irreversible. But for Britain, victory was bittersweet. The empire stood victorious, but hollowed out. Its coffers were empty, its people exhausted. The United States had become the world's new superpower, its wealth and industry unmatched. The Soviet Union had emerged as another. Between them, a new tension began to brew, the Cold War. Britain, once the world's ruler, now found itself a weary mediator. Its colonies had seen too much, sacrificed too much to remain silent. In India, independence was no longer a dream, but a certainty. In Africa, the stirrings of nationalism grew stronger. Across the globe, the red of the empire began to fade into the colors of new nations. Still, for one shining moment in 1945, the empire could believe it had done something transcendent. It had stood, against all odds, as the world burned. It had faced darkness and refused to surrender. London, battered, scarred, but still standing, rang with joy. The streets filled with soldiers and civilians alike, embracing strangers, waving flags, dancing in the rain of confetti and tears. The bells of St. Paul's Cathedral pealed again, echoing through a city that had nearly been erased. The empire's heart still beat, though faintly, not with the rhythm of conquest, but of endurance. The age of empire was ending. The age of resilience had begun. And as the sun set over the scarred horizon, Britain and the world it once ruled took its first fragile steps into a new, uncertain dawn. The war had ended, but the silence that followed was not peace. It was a kind of reckoning. Britain had stood tall, had bled, had survived, but survival is not the same as victory. The empire that had once spanned the world now felt hollow, stretched, and strangely quiet. The red that covered the map of the world still glowed, but its edges had begun to flicker and fade. The year was 1945, and Britain stood at a crossroads. The war had bankrupted the empire. London's docks were in ruins, its people weary, its coffers empty. The great imperial power that had ruled for centuries was now reliant on American loans to feed and rebuild its cities. The United States, once Britain's colony, had become its benefactor. And across the empire, the people who had fought and died for the British crown began to ask the question that could no longer be silenced. If we can die for Britain, why can we not live free from it? The winds of change began to blow. In India, the call for independence had become unstoppable. The Quit India movement had been crushed during the war, but its spirit had only grown stronger. Gandhi, frail but unbroken, returned to public life. His spinning wheel became the quiet engine of revolution. Alongside him stood Jawaharlal Nehru, eloquent and determined, and Muhammad Ali Jinnah, sharp and unyielding, two men who would soon divide an empire and reshape the world. Britain's Labour government under Clement Attlee saw the truth. The empire could not hold India forever. The moral argument was lost, the financial burden unbearable. And so, in 1947, after nearly 2 centuries of British rule, India was granted independence. But freedom came with a wound. The subcontinent split. India and Pakistan divided along religious lines. Partition tore through the land like a blade, unleashing violence, exile and grief. Millions fled their homes. Hundreds of thousands were killed. Trains arrived at stations filled only with the dead. The empire's departure was not gentle. It was soaked in sorrow. Yet even amid tragedy, the world changed irrevocably. The jewel in the crown was gone, and with it, the certainty that Britain ruled by destiny. The empire was now becoming something else, something undefined, something new. In the years that followed, one colony after another began to rise, to speak, to demand. Burma, Ceylon, Malaya, Sudan, Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Cyprus, Jamaica. Each name once spoken as a possession now began to sound like a nation. Some transitions were peaceful, negotiated through diplomacy. Others came through pain, uprisings, protests and bloodshed. In Kenya, the Mau Mau rebellion erupted in the 1950s, a cry against land seizure and racial oppression. The British responded with brutal counterinsurgency, detaining tens of thousands in camps. The empire that had once prided itself on justice now carried the stain of cruelty once more. In Malaya, communist guerrillas waged war in the jungle, and British troops fought a long, costly campaign to suppress them. In Egypt, protests over British occupation and control of the Suez Canal escalated into nationalist fury. In 1952, King Farouk was overthrown. A young officer named Gamal Abdel Nasser emerged as Egypt's new voice, proud, independent, and defiant. Nasser's challenge would soon shake the empire to its core. By the mid-1950s, Britain tried to redefine its shrinking influence through alliances. It helped form NATO, stood beside the United States in the Cold War, and tried to believe that it still mattered in this new bipolar world. But beneath the surface, the empire's old habits lingered, the illusion of control, the language of power. Then came the Suez Crisis of 1956, the moment the world realized that the British Empire was truly over. When Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain, alongside France and Israel, launched a secret invasion to retake it. The plan was swift and audacious, but the world was no longer ruled from London or Paris. The United States, furious at the reckless act, demanded that Britain withdraw. The Soviet Union thundered in protest. The pressure was unbearable. Within days, British troops retreated, humiliated, not defeated by arms, but by global opinion. The illusion of imperial authority shattered in an instant. For centuries, Britain had shaped the world. Now the world had told Britain, enough. At home, the empire's twilight was bittersweet. The 1950s were years of rationing, rebuilding and reflection. Streets still bore the scars of bombings. Families lived in modest council houses. Yet out of austerity came resilience, a quiet, stoic pride that Britain could endure, even without empire. Immigration began to change the face of the island. Ships like the Empire Windrush arrived from the Caribbean, carrying men and women eager to help rebuild the mother country. They worked in factories, hospitals and transport, bringing new rhythms, new voices and new cultures. Britain, once the ruler of diverse lands, now became home to the people of those lands. The empire was folding inward, its history coming home. Through the 1960s, independence movements accelerated. Britain, weary and wiser, granted freedom with less resistance. Nigeria became independent in 1960, Tanganyika and Uganda soon after. Kenya gained freedom in 1963. Its leader, Jomo Kenyatta, once branded a terrorist, now hailed as a statesman. The world map was transforming before Britain's eyes. And yet, something remarkable happened. Rather than vanishing into isolation, Britain helped build something new, the Commonwealth of Nations. It was not an empire, but a family, voluntary, diverse, bound by shared history and language. Former colonies, once ruled, now stood as equals. It was an imperfect but hopeful evolution, a transformation from dominion to dialogue. As the red faded from the maps, Britain sought a new identity. No longer an empire, what was it now? It looked across the Atlantic toward the United States ally, rival, successor, and across the Channel toward Europe, joining the European Economic Community decades later, hoping for relevance in a world no longer ruled by empires. The empire had not vanished overnight. It lingered, in the language of law, the design of cities, the railways that stitched continents together, the English tongue that echoed in classrooms from Lagos to Lahore. The legacy was everywhere, sometimes as progress, sometimes as pain. By the 1970s, the last colonial outposts, Hong Kong, Gibraltar, the Falklands, were remnants of a lost age. Yet in some hearts, nostalgia clung like mist. The idea of empire, its grandeur, its myths, its pride, refused to die entirely. But history had turned its page. The empires of Europe had given way to a world of nations, proud, complex, connected. And Britain, once their ruler, was learning to be something new. Not an empire of dominion, but an island of memory, influence, and imagination. In the Caribbean, steel drums played songs of independence. In Africa, flags of new nations rose against orange sunsets. In Asia, the descendants of colonial subjects built their own modern empires of technology, art, and trade. And though Britain no longer commanded the world, its voice remained woven into the fabric of it, in language, in law, in story. By the end of the 20th century, the British Empire, once the mightiest the world had ever seen, had become a story. A vast, imperfect, unforgettable story of ambition and cruelty, of discovery and oppression, of ships that carried both scholars and chains. And in that story, the world saw its reflection, the beauty and the tragedy of power itself. The winds of change had blown through every corner of the globe, scattering the old world like leaves. Yet out of that storm came something gentler, the understanding that every empire must someday give way to the people it once ruled, and that the measure of history lies not in what is conquered, but in what is learned. The empire was gone. But the world it had shaped, and been shaped by, remained. And in that long twilight, Britain stood once more at the edge of the sea, watching the sun dip below the horizon of its own making, whispering, softly, humbly, to the waves that had once carried it everywhere. We were vast. We were flawed. We were human. The empire had ended, at least on paper. The red faded from the maps, the ships sailed home, and the governors packed their belongings. But history is not so easily dismissed. Empires do not truly vanish. They dissolve into memory, into language, into the unspoken architecture of everyday life. By the dawn of the 1970s, Britain was no longer the ruler of the world, yet the world still carried traces of Britain everywhere it turned, from the railways of India to the parliaments of Africa, from Caribbean classrooms to Pacific courtrooms, echoes of imperial design lingered. English had become the language of diplomacy and business, of law and literature. The empire had left behind no throne, but a voice, and that voice still spoke, sometimes in pride, sometimes in pain. In Britain itself, the imperial legacy could be seen on every street corner. The food, the faces, the music, all changed. Ships like the Empire Windrush, which had docked in 1948, brought waves of migration from the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. They came as citizens of the empire, invited to rebuild the mother country that the war had scarred. Nurses, teachers, engineers, dock workers, they stepped onto the cobblestones of London, Liverpool and Birmingham with hope in their hearts and Britain in their passports. But the welcome was complicated. For some, these new arrivals were proof that the empire lived on, that the Commonwealth was real, a shared future rather than a conquered past. For others, they were a mirror of what Britain had lost, a reminder that the empire was not gone, only reversed. By the 1960s and 70s, British cities had begun to hum with new rhythms, reggae and bhangra, gospel and calypso. Curry houses lit up the night streets, and churches and mosques rose side by side. The empire had come home, yet with change came friction. The promise of equality often collided with prejudice. Signs reading, "No blacks, no Irish, no dogs," appeared in lodging windows. Riots broke out in Notting Hill and Bristol, born of frustration and injustice. The empire's old hierarchies had crossed the sea, invisible but still present. And through it all, Britain wrestled with a question that had no easy answer. What does it mean to be British when British once meant empire? While the empire's physical rule had ended, its economic and political patterns endured. Global trade routes, set during the imperial centuries, continued to favor the old metropole. The Commonwealth, though symbolic, kept former colonies within a loose orbit of influence. In universities and government halls, imperial history was spoken of politely, often as legacy rather than domination. But beneath the politeness, the shadows of empire were everywhere. In India, railways that once carried soldiers and cotton now carried millions to work and school. In Nigeria, British-style parliamentary systems endured, though often fractured under the weight of local tensions. In Kenya, memories of detention camps and rebellion lingered behind every independence anniversary. And in the Caribbean, the languages of empire mingled with the rhythms of resistance. English laced with African melody, poetry born from survival. The empire's legal codes, its borders, even its bureaucracies became the skeleton of the modern world. A world both liberated and haunted by its design. As the 20th century moved forward, Britain faced a different kind of empire, an empire of memory. Historians began to write differently, no longer about conquest and glory, but about consequence. They uncovered stories long buried: the famine in Bengal, the brutality in Kenya, the dispossession of indigenous lands in Australia. Voices once silenced by empire began to speak. In the 1980s, the conversation deepened. The old nostalgia, the "we gave them railways" defense, began to crumble under the weight of truth. The British public, for generations fed on tales of explorers and civilizers, began to glimpse the cost, the lives taken, the cultures erased, the economies reshaped to serve the crown. Still, there was pride, too, a complicated pride. The empire had also spread ideas that outlasted it: constitutional law, civil service, education, and, paradoxically, the very language of freedom that helped colonies demand independence. The empire's greatest export, perhaps, was the notion that no empire should last forever. Britain itself continued to evolve. The children of empire immigrants and their descendants became citizens, artists, thinkers, leaders. By the late 20th century, Britain was no longer a white insular island but a mosaic of its own history. The rhythm of London's streets was now global. Caribbean steel bands in Notting Hill, Pakistani cricketers in the Park, Nigerian traders in Brixton, Jamaican poets in Camden. The empire had transformed from a structure of domination into a shared if uneasy inheritance. Yet the reckoning was not over. Debates raged over statues and symbols, over what should be remembered and what should be removed. Streets named after slave traders, universities built on colonial wealth, all became battlegrounds of memory. Some clung to nostalgia, others demanded acknowledgement. Britain, so skilled at ruling history, struggled now to own it. In former colonies, too, the empire's shadow stretched long. Lines drawn on maps in London continued to shape conflicts in Africa and the Middle East. Economies once molded for extraction still bore the marks of dependency. Languages imposed by empire became bridges and barriers alike. But even in the pain there was resilience and reinvention. The nations once bound under a crown began to shine in their own light. India became a democracy of 1 billion people. Nigeria rose as Africa's giant. Jamaica, Kenya, Singapore, Malaysia, and dozens more built their futures from fragments of empire, forging new identities in the aftermath of conquest. And through it all, they carried a strange dual inheritance, a legacy of oppression and of connection. By the 1990s, the British Empire had been gone for decades, but the phrase still stirred something: fascination, pride, guilt, curiosity. It had become mythic, larger than life, both loved and loathed. In films, novels, and classrooms, the empire lived again, as story. The crown, now symbolic, presided over a commonwealth of independent nations. Queen Elizabeth II, born during the height of empire, now reigned over a world transformed. Her coronation in 1953 had been broadcast across an empire. Her later tours were pilgrimages to countries once ruled, now respected. As the 20th century faded into the 21st, the empire's story entered a new chapter, one not written in conquest, but in reflection. The descendants of colonized peoples walked the same halls as the descendants of colonizers. Their shared history was no longer about domination, but about coexistence, conversation, and correction. And yet, the questions remained, whispered in classrooms and coffee shops, debated in parliament and poetry alike. Was the empire a force for progress or pain? Can a nation ever escape the weight of what it built? Is legacy a burden or a bridge? The answers were never simple, because history rarely is. The British Empire was neither wholly monstrous nor wholly magnificent. It was a human creation, ambitious, greedy, curious, cruel, visionary, and flawed. It had shaped the modern world and in turn had been shaped by it. Its ships had carried explorers and exploiters. Its language had written both declarations of liberty and orders of enslavement. Its flag had flown over palaces and prisons alike. And in the quiet of the modern world, long after the trumpets of empire had fallen silent, its echoes could still be heard, in accents, in institutions, in ideals. The empire's legacy was not just in what it left behind, but in what humanity chose to do with it. To learn, to listen, to remember, and perhaps, in remembering, to ensure that the age of empires would never come again. The waves still broke softly against the island's shores, just as they had for 1,000 years. The same restless tides that had once carried ships of conquest and trade now whispered a gentler rhythm, not of empire, but of endurance. Britain stood smaller now, humbler perhaps, but still there, the old island at the heart of so many stories. By the dawn of the 21st century, the empire had become memory, not gone, but transformed. Its crimson shadow no longer spread across the map, yet its pulse could still be felt in 1,000 subtle ways. In the words people spoke, in the institutions they built, in the shared histories that crossed oceans. The world that had once been ruled from London now ruled itself, yet London still echoed with the world's voices. The empire had vanished, but the connections it created remained. Britain was no longer the imperial power of legend, but a participant in a new, tangled order, global, interdependent, unpredictable. The age of gunboats and governors was over. The age of diplomacy, migration, and memory had begun. In cities like London, Manchester, and Birmingham, the empire lived on, not in politics, but in people. The children and grandchildren of those who had once been ruled by Britain now lived, worked, and dreamed within its borders. The city had become a living map of the old empire. Caribbean markets beside Indian curry houses, Nigerian churches beside Irish pubs, Pakistani call centers beside Gothic cathedrals. It was not the empire reborn, but something new, a reflection of what empire had made possible and of what it had taken. As the 20th century faded, Britain's global role continued to evolve. The Commonwealth of Nations, once an experiment in goodwill, had grown into a vast if loose network of over 50 countries, all once touched by empire, now joined by choice. It was not a kingdom, nor an alliance, but a conversation across history. The Queen, Elizabeth II, became the symbol of continuity, her quiet dignity spanning an era that began in the ruins of the Second World War and stretched into the digital age. Her face, once stamped on coins from Fiji to Canada, now became a thread connecting nations that no longer bowed but remembered. For many, she embodied the strange duality of the post-imperial world, the grace of tradition, the burden of history. Yet, even as the Commonwealth celebrated unity, Britain itself wrestled with questions of belonging. What did it mean to be British, now that Britain ruled no one? The answer was neither simple nor singular. In the decades after decolonization, Britain turned toward Europe, joining the European Economic Community in the 1970s. It was a practical choice, an embrace of geography over nostalgia, but beneath it lingered unease. Britain had always been both part of Europe and apart from it, an island looking outward, not inward. As time passed, this tension deepened. The memory of empire, of independence, of global reach, made Britain's relationship with Europe complicated. Some saw Brussels as a new empire, others as salvation from the past. The debates over sovereignty, trade, and identity were not new. They were echoes of old imperial instincts reshaped for a new century. Then in 2016, a referendum redrew Britain's course once again. The vote to leave the European Union, Brexit, was framed as a return to independence, a reclaiming of destiny. Yet beneath the slogans, the old ghosts stirred. Words like global Britain, sovereignty, and freedom carried a faint imperial echo. The empire, though gone, still lived in the nation's imagination, as pride, as pain, as longing. For some, it remained a story of greatness, of explorers and engineers, of railways and parliaments, of courage on the seas. For others, it was a story of suffering, of slavery and famine, of domination disguised as civilization. Both were true. Both were Britain. And so the island found itself at a crossroads again, as it had so many times before. Its power was no longer military, but cultural. Its empire was not territorial, but digital, creative, and linguistic. English, once the language of empire, had become the world's common tongue. British literature, film, and music reached every shore. From Shakespeare to the Beatles, from Austen to Attenborough, Britain's voice still carried. But now it was no longer a command, it was a contribution. That was the quiet miracle of the post-imperial age, Britain learning not to lead by might, but by mind. Still, the reckoning with empire's past continued. Schools began to teach the darker sides of history. The slave trade, the famines, the rebellions. Statues were questioned, museums re-examined, reparations discussed. The conversation was no longer about erasing empire, but understanding it, not glorifying or condemning, but remembering truthfully. For the descendants of the colonized, this reckoning was long overdue. For the descendants of the colonizers, it was an awakening. Together, they began to weave a new story, one that acknowledged the wounds of the past and the possibilities of the future. Across the Commonwealth, nations once ruled now stood as equals, vibrant, independent, and confident. India became a technological titan, Nigeria, a cultural powerhouse, Jamaica, a voice of resilience and rhythm. The world that empire, once bound by force, was now connected by choice. Trade, travel, language, and memory forming a different kind of map. And Britain, though smaller in territory, remained immense in influence, a crossroads of cultures, ideas, and dreams. The story of the British Empire had begun with ambition, with ships sailing into the unknown, with kings dreaming of dominion. It had grown into the greatest empire the world had ever seen, and collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. But perhaps the empire's true legacy was not the power it wielded, but the dialogue it left behind, between nations, between cultures, between history and the present. Today, the island that once ruled the waves listens instead. It listens to the accents of the world echoing in its own streets, to the laughter of children whose ancestors stood on both sides of empire's history. It listens to the tides that brought wealth and war, sorrow and song. And as night falls over London, over the Thames and the Towers, you can almost hear the hum of centuries blending into one, the sound of an empire that has become memory, and a memory that has become wisdom. The story of the British Empire is not a tale of heroes or villains, but of human beings, Curious, ambitious, flawed, and unendingly complex, it is a reminder that every civilization rises not to rule, but to learn. That every map, no matter how vast, must someday be redrawn. The red sun has set, but the world it once illuminated still glows, with ideas, with art, with voices that refuse to be forgotten. And on this island, where once the drums of empire beat, there is now a gentler rhythm, of reflection, of renewal, of understanding. The empire is gone. But the story, the human story, continues, and as you drift towards sleep, picture it, the soft roll of the tide against the cliffs of Dover, the gulls circling above, the city lights flickering like embers. Somewhere in that quiet glow, the past and present meet, not as conqueror and conquered, but as companions in the endless tide of history. Because no empire lasts forever, but the echoes of what we build and what we learn always do.